The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Jefferson Community Center, casting long shadows across the scuffed wooden floor. Margaret Chen stood near the entrance, her worn canvas bag hanging from her shoulder, watching as volunteers arranged folding chairs in neat rows. She was 63 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and hands that trembled slightly when she held them still. Those hands had once moved across piano keys with the confidence of someone who had spent decades teaching music, but that was before the diagnosis, before the tremors that had forced her into early retirement 3 years ago. Margaret had been a piano teacher for 37 years, working out of a small studio attached to her home in suburban Portland. Generations of children had passed through that studio, their fingers stumbling over scales and arpeggios until muscle memory took over and something like music emerged. She had taught them Chopin and Mozart, nursery rhymes and pop songs, whatever kept them interested enough to return week after week. Some had gone on to study music seriously. Most had simply learned to appreciate the instrument, to find joy in creating something beautiful with their own hands. Margaret had never minded either outcome. For her, the true victory was always in the moment when a student's face lit up with understanding, when they finally heard what their practice had been building toward. But Parkinson's disease had stolen that from her. The tremors had started small, barely noticeable, just a slight shake in her left hand that she could hide by keeping it in motion. She had ignored it for months, convincing herself it was stress or fatigue or simply getting older. When the symptoms became impossible to dismiss, when parents started noticing her hands shaking during lessons and asking gentle, concerned questions, she finally went to a neurologist. The diagnosis came on a Thursday afternoon in February, delivered with clinical efficiency by a doctor young enough to be her son. Essential tremor, he had said initially, but further tests revealed the truth. Parkinson's, early stage, manageable with medication but progressive and incurable. Margaret had finished out the school year, pushing through lessons even as her hands betrayed her more frequently. She stopped demonstrating pieces for her students, relying instead on recordings and verbal instruction. By June, she knew she couldn't continue. The liability alone was concerning, but more than that, she couldn't bear to watch her students' faces as they noticed her declining control. Music had always been about precision, about the exact pressure of a finger on a key, about timing measured in fractions of seconds. What could she teach when her own body refused to obey such commands? The retirement had been devastating in ways she hadn't anticipated. The loss of income was manageable. Her husband Richard worked as an accountant and their house was paid off. But the loss of purpose left a void that nothing seemed to fill. She tried gardening, but her hands made delicate work impossible. She tried volunteering at the library, but sitting still for hours made the tremors worse. She tried book clubs and walking groups and watercolor classes, searching for something that might restore the sense of meaning that teaching had given her. Richard had been patient and supportive, never pushing but always encouraging. He was the one who had seen the notice about the community center's benefit concert, a fundraiser for youth music programs in underserved neighborhoods. He had mentioned it casually over breakfast, sliding the newspaper across the table and pointing to the small advertisement. They were looking for volunteer performers, nothing formal, just community members willing to share their musical talents. Margaret had dismissed it immediately. The thought of performing in public with her condition seemed absurd, almost cruel. What would she play? How would she even make it through a simple piece without her hands locking up or shaking so badly that the notes became indistinguishable? But the idea had lingered. Over the following days, she found herself thinking about the concert, about the students it would benefit, about the children who might never have access to music education without programs like these. She thought about her own students, about the ones who had struggled financially, whose parents had paid for lessons with carefully counted bills or traded services because they believed music mattered. She thought about what music had given her, not just a career but a language for emotions too complex for words, a way to connect with something larger than herself. A week after Richard had shown her the notice, Margaret had called the community center. The woman who answered, bright-voiced and enthusiastic, had been thrilled to add her to the roster. She hadn't asked about Margaret's experience or what she planned to perform. She had simply taken down her name and told her the concert was scheduled for 3 weeks away, on a Saturday afternoon in late September. Performers should arrive by 1 o'clock for a brief sound check. The show would start at 2. Dress was casual. Just come ready to share your gift, the woman had said, and Margaret had nearly laughed at the innocence of it. Now standing in the community center on the day of the concert, Margaret felt the full weight of what she had committed to. Around her, other performers were arriving, a mix of ages and abilities that ranged from a teenager with an electric guitar to an elderly man carrying a violin case that looked older than Margaret herself. There was a woman about Margaret's age warming up her voice in the corner, running through scales with the ease of someone who had sung for decades. A young girl, no more than 10, sat at the rented upright piano on the small stage, playing through what sounded like a Beethoven sonatina with impressive competence. Margaret's hands were shaking worse than usual. She had taken her medication that morning, timing it carefully so it would be at peak effectiveness during her performance, but anxiety always made the tremors worse. She pressed her hands together, trying to still them, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. Richard appeared beside her, having parked the car, and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything, didn't offer false reassurance or ask if she was okay. He just stood there solid and present, and that was enough. The organizer, a woman named Patricia with short gray hair and the kind of boundless energy that Margaret associated with longtime volunteers, gathered the performers near the stage. She explained the order of performances, which had been arranged to create variety and maintain audience interest. Margaret would be performing 7th, roughly halfway through the program. Patricia emphasized that this was a supportive, casual environment, that mistakes were completely acceptable, that the audience was there to support local arts and wouldn't judge anyone harshly. Her words were meant to comfort, but Margaret felt them land like small weights. The lower the expectations, the more obvious it would be that she couldn't meet even those. Margaret had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for this moment, and preparation had been its own kind of torture. She couldn't practice the way she once had, couldn't run through a piece dozens of times until it became automatic. Her hands wouldn't allow for that kind of repetition. Instead, she had chosen the simplest piece she could think of, a children's song called Twinkle Twinkle Little Star that every beginning piano student learned. It was humiliating in its simplicity, a tune that 5-year-olds mastered in their first month of lessons, but it was all she trusted herself to play. Even that simple piece had required modification. She had arranged it in a way that minimized the movement required, keeping her hands in a comfortable position, avoiding stretches that might trigger cramping or spasms. She had practiced it slowly, excruciatingly slowly, focusing on each individual note rather than the flow of the melody. She had practiced it with her medication and without at different times of day, trying to understand how her body would respond under various conditions. Richard had listened patiently, never commenting on the repetition or the obvious difficulty she had with even this most basic piece. The concert began, and Margaret took a seat in the audience near the back, wanting to watch the other performers but also needing an easy exit if her nerves became too much. The teenager with the guitar went first, playing a credible version of a contemporary pop song with only a few minor mistakes. The audience, about 50 people scattered across the 100 or so chairs, applauded warmly. Next came a middle-aged man who played harmonica, running through a series of folk tunes with cheerful competence. Then the young girl Margaret had seen earlier, who performed her Beethoven piece with the kind of careful precision that suggested a dedicated teacher and devoted parents. Each performance brought the moment of Margaret's own closer. She felt her heart rate increasing, felt the tremor in her hands intensifying. She tried the breathing exercises her doctor had recommended, slow inhales and exhales meant to calm the nervous system, but they did little to ease the rising panic. This had been a mistake, she should never have agreed to this. What had she been thinking? That somehow she could reclaim what Parkinson's had taken from her, that a simple children's song would prove she was still a musician. The whole endeavor suddenly seemed pathetic, a desperate grasp at relevance by someone whose time had passed. Richard must have sensed her spiraling thoughts because he reached over and took her hand, holding it firmly but gently. His touch was warm and steady, and for a moment the tremor seemed to quiet. He leaned close and whispered that she didn't have to do this, that they could leave right now if she wanted, that no one would think less of her. And in that moment of permission, of being given an escape, Margaret felt something shift. She realized that leaving would be easier, safer, but it would also confirm what she had feared most over the past 3 years, that Parkinson's hadn't just changed her, it had defeated her, had taken not just her ability but her willingness to try. She squeezed Richard's hand and whispered back that she was going to do it. He nodded, unsurprised, and released her hand. On stage, a woman was playing flute, the notes clear and bright in the afternoon air. Margaret watched her fingers move across the keys, sure and practiced, and felt a familiar ache. That certainty of motion, that trust between intention and execution, she missed it more than she had words to express. But she also knew that grief and nostalgia wouldn't help her now. What she needed was focus, the same focus she had tried to teach her students, the ability to be present with each individual note rather than lost in what came before or what might come after. Patricia was calling her name. Margaret stood, feeling Richard's encouraging pat on her back, and made her way to the stage. The walk felt longer than it should have, each step deliberate, conscious of eyes watching her. She climbed the 3 stairs to the stage carefully, holding the railing, aware that balance was another thing Parkinson's affected. The piano waited, the same upright that the young girl had played earlier, its keys slightly yellowed with age but perfectly serviceable. Margaret sat on the bench, adjusting her position, placing her feet on the pedals out of habit, even though she wouldn't need them for such a simple piece. She looked out at the audience, at the faces watching her with polite attention. Most were strangers, people from the community who had come to support local arts, or because they had children who might benefit from the programs this concert funded. A few faces were familiar, neighbors who had heard she would be performing. And there in the back, Richard watching her with an expression of such complete faith that it nearly broke her composure. She turned back to the piano, placed her hands over the keys, and felt them trembling badly enough that she had to pause, had to breathe, had to remember why she was here. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Margaret's hands hovered above the keys, trembling in a way that made her acutely aware of every eye in the room. She had prepared herself for this moment, had rehearsed not just the music but the act of sitting here, exposed and vulnerable in front of strangers. Yet nothing had truly prepared her for the reality of it, for the weight of silence that filled the community center as people waited for her to begin. She could hear someone cough in the back row, could hear the rustle of a program being folded, could hear her own breathing, too quick and shallow. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself the way she had taught countless students to do before recitals. Find your breath, she had always told them. Feel the bench beneath you. Remember that the piano is your friend, not your enemy. The advice felt hollow now, coming from her own memory, because the piano had never felt less like a friend. It felt like a judge, waiting to reveal her inadequacy, to make visible what she had tried so hard to hide from herself over the past 3 years. But she had committed to this. She had told Richard she would do it. More than that, she had told herself that she would try, that even if she failed spectacularly, the trying mattered. So she opened her eyes, lowered her hands to the keys, and began. The first note came out clear, a simple C in the middle register, and for a fraction of a second Margaret felt a flutter of hope. But the second note wavered, her fingers slipping slightly, producing a sound that wasn't quite wrong but wasn't quite right either. The third note was better, the fourth worse. Her hands were shaking visibly now, and she could feel her face flushing with embarrassment. Twinkle Twinkle Little Star was perhaps the simplest piece in the entire piano repertoire. A melody that most people could pick out with one finger, yet Margaret was struggling with it as though it were a Rachmaninoff concerto. The notes came unevenly, some held too long, others cut too short, the rhythm lurching forward and stumbling back. She tried to focus on each individual note as she had practiced, but her mind kept jumping ahead, anticipating the next mistake, the next moment of public failure. Halfway through the first line, her right hand seized up momentarily, the tremor intensifying into a brief spasm that caused her to strike 2 keys simultaneously, producing a jarring discord. She stopped. The silence that followed felt enormous, crushing. Margaret stared at the keys at her traitor hands and felt tears pricking at her eyes. This was it. This was the moment she would stand up, apologize to the audience, and leave the stage, confirming every fear she had harbored about performing in public with Parkinson's. She could already imagine the sympathetic looks, the awkward applause meant to soften her humiliation, the well-meaning comments afterward about how brave she had been to try. But as she sat there, frozen in her failure, something unexpected happened. Someone in the audience began to clap, a slow, steady rhythm that wasn't applause but encouragement, a beat to follow. Margaret looked up, searching for the source, and saw a woman in the third row, perhaps in her 40s, clapping with deliberate patience. Then another person joined in, and another, until a dozen people were clapping in unison, creating a tempo for her to follow. They weren't rushing her or expressing impatience. They were offering her a lifeline, a way back into the music. Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, some tight knot of shame and fear loosening just enough to let her breathe. She looked back at the piano, at the keys that suddenly seemed less like instruments of judgment and more like what they had always been, tools for making music. She placed her hands back in position, and this time when she began, she followed the clapping, let it guide her tempo, let it steady her rhythm. The notes came more evenly now, still imperfect, still marked by the tremor in her hands, but following a beat that existed outside her own nervous system. The audience continued clapping, maintaining that steady rhythm, and Margaret continued playing. She made it through the first complete line of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, then the second. Her hands were still shaking, the notes were still sometimes wrong, but there was something happening here that transcended technical perfection. The community center had transformed from a place of judgment into a place of collaboration. The audience no longer passive observers but active participants in her struggle and her small victories. As she reached the final line of the simple melody, Margaret realized she was crying, tears running down her cheeks unchecked. But they weren't tears of humiliation or defeat. They were tears of gratitude, of connection, of the profound relief that comes from being seen in your vulnerability and met not with pity but with solidarity. She played the last note, letting it ring out in the room, and then the clapping that had been her metronome transformed into applause, genuine and warm and completely undeserved by any measure of musical excellence. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys and looked out at the audience. People were standing now, not all of them but many, applauding with an enthusiasm that seemed wildly disproportionate to what she had just played. She saw faces smiling at her, not with the condescending sympathy she had feared, but with something that looked like joy, like appreciation for something they had witnessed that went beyond a simple children's song played imperfectly. Richard was standing in the back, his eyes bright with tears that matched her own, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Patricia appeared beside the piano, her own eyes suspiciously moist, and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. She didn't say anything, didn't offer commentary or try to explain what had just happened. She simply gave Margaret's shoulder a gentle squeeze, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, before helping her stand and guiding her back down the stage stairs. Margaret's legs felt unsteady, whether from Parkinson's or emotion she couldn't tell, but Patricia's hand remained supportive until she was safely back in her seat beside Richard. Richard pulled her into a hug the moment she sat down, holding her tight while she continued to cry, the tears flowing freely now in relief and release. Around them the concert continued, the next performer already taking the stage, but Margaret barely registered it. She was too busy processing what had just happened, too busy trying to understand how something she had anticipated as her greatest humiliation had somehow become something else entirely, something that felt almost like redemption. As her breathing slowly returned to normal and her tears subsided, Margaret became aware of people approaching her during the brief break before the next performance. The woman who had started the clapping came over first, introducing herself as Diana and explaining that her father had Parkinson's, that she understood what it took for Margaret to get on that stage. A teenage boy told her he thought what she did was brave, that he had been nervous about his own performance later but now felt like he could do it. An older gentleman simply shook her hand and said thank you, offering no explanation but needing none. Each interaction brought fresh tears, but they were different now, lighter somehow, as though something heavy she had been carrying for 3 years was finally being set down. These people didn't see her as a failed musician or a victim of disease. They saw her as someone who had tried something difficult, who had struggled publicly, who had been helped and had accepted that help with grace. They saw her perhaps more clearly than she had been able to see herself since the diagnosis. The concert continued around her, but Margaret found herself thinking about her students, about all the times she had watched them struggle with a piece, their faces tight with concentration and frustration. She had always told them that mistakes were part of learning, that the goal wasn't perfection but progress. But she realized now that she had never truly applied that wisdom to herself. She had held herself to an impossible standard, had judged herself by the abilities she had lost rather than what remained, had forgotten that music was meant to be joyful, messy, human. When the concert ended, after all the performers had taken their turns and Patricia had given a short speech thanking everyone for their support and announcing how much money had been raised for youth music programs, people lingered in the community center, talking and laughing and sharing the kind of easy fellowship that comes from a shared experience. Margaret found herself in the center of several conversations, discussing not just music but Parkinson's, teaching, the importance of arts education, the challenge of maintaining identity when illness threatens to define you. A mother approached her with a young boy who looked about 7, shy and hiding partially behind his mother's leg. The mother explained that her son wanted to learn piano but they couldn't afford lessons, that she had brought him to the concert hoping to inspire his interest. She asked if Margaret still taught, and for a moment Margaret felt the familiar pain of loss, the reminder of what she had given up. But then she looked at the boy's face, at the cautious hope there, and heard herself saying that while she couldn't teach in the traditional way, she might be able to work with him to find an approach that accommodated her limitations. The mother's face lit up with gratitude, and they exchanged phone numbers, making tentative plans to meet the following week to discuss possibilities. As the woman and her son walked away, Margaret felt Richard's arm around her waist. He didn't say "I told you so," didn't point out that he had been encouraging her for months to find ways to stay connected to music. He just held her and let her absorb what had happened, the unexpected turns the afternoon had taken. The week following the concert passed in a strange blur of emotion and reflection. Margaret found herself returning again and again to those moments on stage, not to the mistakes or the trembling hands, but to the sound of that collective clapping, to the feeling of being carried by something larger than herself. She had expected shame and had found connection instead. She had expected to confront her limitations and had discovered something else, something harder to name but equally true about resilience and community and the ways people show up for each other. Richard noticed the change in her, the way she seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of what Parkinson's had taken from her. She started spending time at the piano again, not practicing in the rigorous way she once had, but simply sitting at the bench and playing through fragments of pieces she remembered, letting her hands move as they were able without judgment or expectation. Some days were better than others. Some days the tremors made even simple melodies impossible. But she was learning to accept that variation, to work with what her body offered rather than raging against what it withheld. The mother who had approached her after the concert, whose name was Linda, called 3 days later. They arranged to meet at Margaret's house on a Saturday morning, and when Linda arrived with her son Michael, Margaret felt a flutter of the old excitement she had always experienced before meeting a new student. Michael was indeed 7 years old, small for his age, with dark eyes that took in everything and a seriousness that seemed unusual in someone so young. He stood in front of the piano in Margaret's studio, the converted sunroom where she had taught for decades, and placed his hands on the keys without prompting, as though he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. Margaret watched him explore the piano, touching keys randomly, listening to the sounds they made, beginning to understand the relationship between action and result. She saw Linda watching too, her face a mixture of hope and worry, probably calculating costs and time commitments and whether this would be worth the sacrifice. Margaret understood that calculation. She had seen it on countless parents' faces over the years, the weighing of resources against possibility, the leap of faith required to invest in something as intangible as music education. She explained to Linda that she could no longer teach in the traditional way, that her Parkinson's meant she couldn't always demonstrate techniques or play examples. But she could teach music theory, could guide Michael's learning through verbal instruction, could help him develop his ear and his understanding of how music worked. She could do it for free, she added, seeing Linda's face begin to form a protest. This wasn't charity, she explained. This was something she needed, a way to stay connected to teaching, to purpose, to the part of herself that Parkinson's hadn't touched. Linda had cried, embarrassing herself and apologizing, but Margaret understood. These were the tears of a parent who wanted desperately to give her child opportunities, who worked 2 jobs and still struggled to cover basic necessities, who saw in piano lessons not just music but a door to a different future. They agreed to start with 1 lesson a week, 30 minutes on Saturday mornings, and to see how it went. If it didn't work, if Margaret's condition made teaching impossible, or if Michael lost interest, they would reevaluate. But they would try. That first lesson was both wonderful and frustrating. Michael was eager and bright, picking up concepts quickly, but Margaret struggled to guide his hand position without being able to demonstrate properly. Her own hands shook too much to show him how to curve his fingers or position his wrist, and she found herself having to describe in words what she had always shown through example. It required a different kind of teaching, more patience and creativity. But by the end of the 30 minutes, Michael had learned the names of the keys and could play a simple 5-note scale. As weeks passed and lessons continued, Margaret developed new techniques for teaching around her limitations. She used videos to demonstrate what her hands couldn't, drew diagrams to illustrate concepts, and discovered that being forced to verbalize everything made her a more thoughtful instructor. Michael thrived under her guidance, his natural musical ability becoming more apparent with each lesson. He had good ears, could hear when he was off-pitch or off-tempo, and most importantly, he loved it. She could see it in the way his face lit up when he got something right, in the way he talked eagerly about what he wanted to learn next. Word spread in Linda's circle of friends and acquaintances that Margaret was teaching again, adapted lessons that didn't cost anything for families who couldn't afford traditional instruction. Another parent called, then another. Within 2 months, Margaret had 4 students, all children from families who wanted music education for their kids but couldn't manage the cost. She set up a schedule, spreading the lessons throughout the week, keeping each one short enough that her energy and medication could sustain her through it. The teaching gave structure to her days, but more than that, it gave her a sense of contribution that she had been missing desperately. She wasn't the teacher she had been before Parkinson's, couldn't offer the same kind of intensive technical instruction, but she was offering something valuable nonetheless. She was opening doors, creating possibilities, helping children discover whether music might be a language they wanted to learn to speak. Richard watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. He had never pushed her to return to teaching, had never suggested that she needed to do anything beyond rest and adjust to her diagnosis. But he had known, perhaps better than she had, that Margaret was someone who needed purpose beyond herself, who found meaning in service and contribution. The students weren't replacing what she had lost, But they were giving her something new, a different kind of teaching that played to different strengths. One evening in late November, as Margaret was preparing dinner and Richard was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, he mentioned almost casually that he had been thinking about the community center concert. Margaret paused in her chopping, waiting for him to continue. He said that what had happened there, the way the audience had supported her, had started him thinking about community and what it meant, about how people showed up for each other in unexpected ways. He wondered, still in that casual tone that Margaret now recognized as meaning he had been thinking about this seriously for some time, whether she might consider performing again. Margaret's immediate reaction was resistance. The concert had been meaningful precisely because it was singular, a one-time confrontation with her fears that had gone better than expected. Trying to recreate it felt risky, like pushing her luck, like inviting the universe to deliver the humiliation it had spared her the first time. But Richard continued, explaining that he wasn't suggesting she do the same thing again. He was suggesting something different, something that might build on what she had learned both from the concert and from her adapted teaching methods. He had been talking to Patricia, the organizer at the community center, and she was planning another benefit concert for the spring. But this time, she wanted to include a segment specifically for people with disabilities or health conditions that affected their ability to perform traditionally. She wanted to create a space where adapted performance was not just accepted but celebrated, where the focus was on accessibility and inclusion rather than technical perfection. And she had asked Richard whether Margaret might be interested in helping to organize it, perhaps even performing again. The idea both terrified and intrigued Margaret. Organizing such an event would mean thinking carefully about what performers might need, about how to create an environment where people felt safe to be vulnerable, where struggling wasn't seen as failing. It would mean using her experience, both as a teacher and as someone living with Parkinson's, to build something that hadn't existed before. It would also mean putting herself out there again, risking public struggle, confronting her limitations in front of an audience. She told Richard she needed to think about it, and he nodded, returning to his newspaper and giving her space to process. Over the following days, Margaret found herself mentally planning such an event even as part of her resisted the idea. She thought about what would have helped her at the community center concert, what might help others in similar situations. She thought about her students, about how she had adapted her teaching, about the creativity required to work around limitations rather than being stopped by them. A week after Richard first mentioned it, Margaret called Patricia. They met at a coffee shop near the community center, and Margaret found herself talking more than she usually did, ideas pouring out faster than she could fully organize them. She talked about creating an environment where different kinds of performance were valued, where someone playing a simple melody with trembling hands was celebrated alongside someone playing a complex piece flawlessly. She talked about accessibility not just in terms of physical accommodations, but in terms of expectations and judgment, about making space for the messy, imperfect reality of how people actually make music. Patricia listened with growing enthusiasm, occasionally interjecting questions or suggestions, and by the end of their conversation, they had the rough outline of what they were calling the Adaptive Arts Showcase. It would be held in April, giving them 5 months to plan and recruit performers. They would actively seek out people who had health conditions, disabilities, or other challenges that affected their ability to perform in traditional settings. They would provide whatever accommodations performers needed, whether that was special seating, adjusted lighting, or simply the understanding that stopping and starting was acceptable. Margaret agreed to help organize the event and to perform in it, though she hadn't yet decided what she would play. The commitment felt both exciting and terrifying, but it also felt right, like a natural extension of what she had learned over the past few months. She was beginning to understand that Parkinson's had taken certain abilities from her, but it had also opened up new perspectives, new ways of thinking about music and teaching and performance that she might never have discovered otherwise. Planning the Adaptive Arts Showcase consumed Margaret's winter in the best possible way. She and Patricia met weekly, sometimes more often, working through the countless details that went into creating an event that was truly accessible and welcoming. They consulted with disability advocates, talked to people with various health conditions about what would make them feel comfortable performing, reached out to local organizations that served disabled communities. Each conversation revealed new considerations, new ways of thinking about performance and audience, and the relationship between them. Margaret discovered she had a talent for this kind of organizing, for thinking through the practical and emotional needs of performers who might be managing challenges invisible to casual observers. She insisted on having a quiet room available where performers could rest or manage medical needs. She worked with Patricia to create a program structure that allowed for flexibility, building in extra time between performances so that no one felt rushed. She drafted language for the event description that emphasized celebration and community rather than competition or judgment. Recruiting performers proved easier than Margaret had anticipated. Once word spread about what they were trying to create, people reached out eagerly. There was a woman with multiple sclerosis who wanted to sing but needed to perform while seated. A teenager with cerebral palsy who played guitar but needed extra time to get on and off the stage. An older man who had survived a stroke and was relearning the saxophone, his playing sometimes interrupted by aphasia that affected his breathing control. A young woman with severe anxiety who had never performed publicly but wanted to try in an environment where panic attacks were understood rather than judged. Each performer brought their own story, their own relationship to the limitations they managed, their own reasons for wanting to be part of this showcase. Margaret spoke with many of them individually, either on the phone or in person, and found herself moved again and again by their courage, by their refusal to let health conditions or disabilities cut them off from creative expression. She saw in them echoes of her own journey, the same struggle between wanting to participate in the world and fearing public vulnerability. Her own students were watching this process with interest. Michael, now confidently playing simple pieces with both hands, asked if he could perform at the showcase. Margaret was touched but told him gently that this particular event was specifically for performers managing health challenges. But she promised him there would be other opportunities, other concerts where his growing skills could shine. In truth, she was already thinking about organizing a student recital in the summer, something small and informal that would give her students performance experience without the pressure of a traditional recital. The teaching continued to be one of the most rewarding parts of Margaret's week. She now had 6 students, ranging in age from 5 to 12, all from families who couldn't afford traditional lessons. She had developed a teaching approach that worked around her Parkinson's, using technology and verbal instruction and the students' own discovery to compensate for what she couldn't demonstrate. The students were progressing well, some faster than others, but all developing a genuine love for music that Margaret recognized as more valuable than technical perfection. One of her newer students, a 9-year-old girl named Jasmine, reminded Margaret powerfully of herself at that age. Jasmine had a natural musicality that showed in everything she did, the way she listened to music, the way she moved, the way she approached the piano with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. She also had ADHD, which made traditional lessons challenging. She struggled to sit still for 30 minutes, needed frequent movement breaks, and sometimes couldn't focus on technical exercises no matter how patient Margaret was. But Margaret was learning to teach Jasmine the way Jasmine needed to be taught, with shorter bursts of concentrated work interspersed with movement, with lessons that incorporated rhythm games and physical activity, with music that interested Jasmine enough to hold her attention. It required flexibility and creativity, required Margaret to let go of the structured lesson plans she had relied on for decades, but it was working. Jasmine was learning, was improving, and most importantly, was maintaining her enthusiasm for music. As winter deepened and the showcase drew closer, Margaret began seriously considering what she would perform. Part of her wanted to attempt something more challenging than Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, to show that she had grown since that first concert, that she was capable of more than the absolute simplest music. But another part of her recognized that the point of the showcase wasn't to prove anything about capability. It was to celebrate participation, to honor the effort of showing up and trying regardless of outcome. She talked it over with Richard one evening, expressing her uncertainty about whether to push herself or play it safe. Richard listened, then asked her a question she hadn't considered. What would she tell one of her students in the same situation? Margaret paused, recognizing the wisdom in turning her teaching perspective on herself. She would tell a student to choose something that felt meaningful, something that expressed what they wanted to say, regardless of difficulty level. She would tell them that the audience wouldn't care about complexity, they would care about sincerity and effort. With that in mind, Margaret started exploring her options. She spent hours at the piano, not practicing in any formal sense but simply playing through pieces from her memory, seeing what her hands could manage on good days and what remained beyond her reach even with optimal medication timing. She rediscovered pieces she had loved as a young student, melodies that had meant something to her before teaching and technique and professional standards had complicated her relationship with music. She found herself drawn to a piece she hadn't thought about in years, Clair de Lune by Debussy. It was far more complex than Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but there was a simplified arrangement, an easier version that captured the essential melody and harmony without the virtuosic demands of the full piece. She had learned this arrangement when she was 10 or 11, had loved it for its dreamy quality, for the way it seemed to capture something about moonlight that words couldn't express. Attempting it now, decades later, and with Parkinson's affecting her hands, was humbling and frustrating and occasionally heartbreaking. Her fingers couldn't move with the fluid grace the piece demanded. The sustained notes wavered, the passages that required hands crossing were nearly impossible, the dynamics she wanted to create eluded her control. But there was something there, some core of beauty that survived her imperfect execution, and she found herself returning to it day after day, working through it in small sections, learning what was possible and what wasn't. Richard would sometimes stop in the doorway of the studio while she was working on it, listening without comment. Once, after she had finished a particularly frustrating practice session, he came in and sat beside her on the piano bench. He told her it was beautiful, and she started to protest, to point out all the mistakes and limitations, but he stopped her. He said he wasn't talking about technical perfection. He was talking about what he heard beneath the wrong notes and the trembling keys. The soul of the music that she was managing to convey despite everything working against her. His words stayed with her, reshaping how she thought about her performance. She began to understand that what she was offering wasn't a demonstration of technical skill. It was testimony, a witness to the stubborn persistence of creative expression in the face of physical limitation. It was an assertion that music mattered enough to pursue even when pursuit was difficult, even when the result would inevitably fall short of the ideal she could hear in her head. As winter turned towards spring and April approached, Margaret felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with the familiar anxiety that came with public performance. But this time the anxiety felt different, less about fear of judgment and more about wanting to do justice to the vision she and Patricia had created. The showcase had attracted attention beyond what they had initially expected. Local media had picked up the story, intrigued by the concept of an arts event specifically designed around accessibility and adaptation. The community center had to move the event to their largest room to accommodate the expected audience. The week before the Adaptive Arts Showcase, Margaret experienced a flare-up of her Parkinson's symptoms that left her shaken and worried. The tremors in her hands intensified to the point where even holding a cup of coffee required concentration. Her medication seemed less effective than usual, and her neurologist explained that this sometimes happened with stress, that the anticipation of the performance might be affecting her body's response to treatment. He adjusted her dosage slightly and reminded her that she could always withdraw from performing if she needed to. But withdrawing felt impossible now, not because she was trapped by commitment, but because she had invested so much of herself in this event. She had talked with every performer individually, had encouraged each of them to push past their fears and share their gifts despite the challenges they faced. How could she ask that of others and then retreat when her own symptoms worsened? More than that, she realized that performing with increased tremors might actually be more honest, more representative of what living with Parkinson's really meant. The disease didn't conveniently pause for important events. It demanded accommodation and adaptation in real time. She redoubled her practice on Claire de Lune, but with a different mindset. Instead of fighting against what her hands couldn't do, she began actively working with her limitations, finding ways to interpret the piece that acknowledged rather than disguised the tremor. She let certain notes ring longer to cover transitions she couldn't execute smoothly. She simplified passages that had become impossible with the worsened symptoms. She was creating her own arrangement, adapted not just from the original Debussy, but from the simplified version she had started with, making it uniquely hers through the very constraints she was working within. Her students noticed her increased nervousness during their lessons that week. Michael asked directly if she was okay, his 7-year-old face serious with concern. Margaret appreciated his honesty and answered truthfully that she was nervous about performing but also excited. She told him that being nervous was normal before doing something important, that even professional musicians felt stage fright. Michael considered this and then told her he thought she was brave. The simple statement, delivered with childlike sincerity, brought tears to Margaret's eyes and reminded her why she was doing this. Patricia called 2 days before the showcase to go over final details. The response had exceeded all their expectations. They had 22 performers scheduled, ranging in age from 8 to 76, each bringing their own challenges and their own courage. The audience was expected to number over 200 people, far more than the small community event they had initially envisioned. A local television station wanted to cover it for their evening news. The mayor's office had called to say that a city council member would be attending and wanted to say a few words about the importance of accessible arts programming. The growing scale of the event should have increased Margaret's anxiety, but instead she found it oddly calming. This was bigger than her individual performance now. This was about creating something meaningful for her community, about demonstrating that artistic expression didn't require perfect health or optimal conditions. Whether her own performance went well or poorly, the showcase would still matter. That realization freed her from some of the pressure she had been carrying. The night before the showcase, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed beside Richard, listening to his steady breathing, her mind running through the piece she would play tomorrow. She wasn't rehearsing mentally so much as making peace with whatever would happen. Her hands might shake badly. She might have to stop and restart. She might play wrong notes or lose her place. All of that was possible, perhaps even probable. But she would be there trying, and that act of trying in front of witnesses was itself valuable, regardless of the musical result. Richard stirred and reached for her hand in the darkness, as though sensing her wakefulness even in sleep. His touch was warm and grounding, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this, that whatever happened tomorrow, she had support. She squeezed his hand gently and finally felt herself beginning to relax, to drift towards sleep, to let go of the need to control what she couldn't predict. Morning came bright and clear, an unusually warm April day that felt like a gift. Margaret went through her usual routine, taking her medication with breakfast, doing the gentle stretching exercises her physical therapist had taught her, trying to keep everything as normal as possible. Richard made her favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with herbs from their garden, and they ate together in comfortable silence, both understanding that there wasn't much left to say. The preparation was done. Now there was only the doing. They arrived at the community center 2 hours before the showcase was scheduled to begin. Patricia was already there, looking both excited and slightly frazzled as she coordinated last-minute details. The room had been transformed. Chairs were arranged in curved rows that created an intimate feeling despite the large space. The stage area had been expanded and equipped with various accommodations, including a lift for wheelchair users, adjustable lighting, and multiple microphones at different heights. Fresh flowers decorated the space, and large banners proclaimed the event's theme: all voices, all abilities, all welcome. Margaret found the designated quiet room where performers could prepare privately. Several people were already there, and she recognized faces from her phone conversations and planning meetings. There was Sarah, the woman with multiple sclerosis who would be singing while seated. James, the stroke survivor who was relearning saxophone. Melissa, the young woman with anxiety who was going to play violin despite her hands sometimes shaking as badly as Margaret's own. They greeted each other with the easy familiarity of people who shared something important, a common understanding of what it meant to perform while managing health challenges. They talked quietly about their nervousness, their hopes for the performance, their gratitude for a space where they didn't have to pretend their conditions didn't exist. James mentioned that this would be the first time he had played saxophone publicly since his stroke 3 years ago. Sarah said she hadn't sung for an audience in 5 years, since her MS diagnosis. Melissa admitted she had almost backed out a dozen times, but kept coming back to the idea that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. Margaret listened to their stories and shared her own. The journey from that first community center concert, where she had barely made it through Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, to this moment, preparing to perform a piece that still felt beyond her abilities, but that she was going to attempt anyway. She told them about the audience clapping to give her a rhythm to follow, about how that simple act of support had changed everything for her. She could see several of them tearing up as she spoke, recognizing their own experiences in her words. The time before the showcase started passed more quickly than Margaret expected. Performers came and went from the quiet room, some needing solitude, others drawing strength from the group. Patricia checked in periodically with updates and encouragement. The audience was arriving, filling the seats quickly. Everything was on schedule. Margaret found herself thinking about her students, about Michael and Jasmine and the others, about what she hoped they would learn from seeing her do this. She hoped they would understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. 15 minutes before the showcase was scheduled to begin, Margaret left the quiet room and found a seat in the area reserved for performers. From there, she could see the audience, a sea of faces representing her community. She spotted Linda and Michael in the third row, Michael waving excitedly when he saw her. Her other students were scattered throughout the audience with their families. She saw neighbors, fellow volunteers from various community organizations, and many strangers who had come simply because they believed in what the showcase represented. Richard was sitting near the front, having helped Patricia with some last-minute technical issues. He caught her eye and smiled, a smile full of pride and love and absolute confidence in her. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion but smiled back, drawing strength from his faith in her. Whatever happened in the next few hours, whatever mistakes she made or struggles she faced, she knew he would be there, believing in her, supporting her, loving her exactly as she was. Patricia took the stage to welcome everyone, and the showcase began. The first performer was a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, who had autism and played the drums. His mother had explained during planning that he rarely spoke but communicated beautifully through rhythm. Watching him perform, completely absorbed in the music he was creating, his face alight with joy, Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. This was exactly what they had hoped to create, a space where difference was celebrated, where the usual metrics of performance gave way to something more human and more real. The showcase unfolded like a revelation, each performance adding another layer to what Margaret was coming to understand about courage and community. After the young drummer came an elderly woman with arthritis who played classical guitar, her gnarled fingers moving slowly but purposefully across the strings, creating a melody that was halting but deeply felt. Then James took the stage with his saxophone, his playing interrupted by the aphasia that affected his breathing. But the audience waited patiently through each pause, and the music that emerged was all the more powerful for its imperfection. Sarah sang from her wheelchair, her voice still strong despite the MS that had taken so much of her physical mobility. She performed an old folk song about perseverance, and Margaret wasn't the only person in the audience crying by the time she finished. A teenager with cerebral palsy played guitar, his body's involuntary movements incorporated into his performance rather than hidden, creating a unique interpretation of a contemporary song. An older man who had lost partial hearing played piano, reading the music visually and feeling the vibrations through the instrument. His connection to the music coming through channels most people never had to consider. Between performances, Margaret found herself thinking about all the years she had taught traditional lessons, emphasizing precision and accuracy and technical perfection. Those things had value, she didn't doubt that, but watching these performers, she was seeing something else that mattered just as much and that she had perhaps undervalued. She was seeing authenticity, vulnerability, the raw human need to create and express regardless of whether the tools available were adequate to the vision. Every performer on that stage was demonstrating that the impulse to make music was stronger than the obstacles in its way. Melissa performed about halfway through the program, her violin shaking in her trembling hands, her anxiety visible in every line of her body. But she played through a simple melody with such concentration and determination that the audience seemed to collectively hold its breath, willing her to succeed. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, and Margaret could see the disbelief and joy on Melissa's face as she realized she had done it, had performed publicly despite the anxiety that had held her back for years. Margaret was scheduled to perform near the end of the program, second to last. As the showcase progressed and her turn approached, she felt a strange calm settling over her. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, but now that it was nearly here, she found that the dread had transformed into something else, into a kind of peaceful acceptance. She would go on stage, she would play Claire de Lune as well as her Parkinson's-affected hands allowed, and whatever happened would be exactly what was supposed to happen. When Patricia called her name, Margaret stood and walked to the stage with steady steps. She climbed the stairs carefully, aware of her balance issues but not anxious about them. She sat at the piano, the same upright that had been used throughout the showcase, its keys now familiar from the sound check she had done earlier. She adjusted the bench, positioned her feet, and looked out at the audience. 200 faces looked back, but they didn't feel like judges. They felt like witnesses, like companions on a journey they all shared in different ways. Margaret placed her hands over the keys and felt them trembling, the tremor more pronounced than usual because of her nervousness but not worse than she had anticipated. She took a breath, found her center, and began to play. The opening measures of Claire de Lune came out softer than she intended, her control compromised by the shaking in her hands, but the essential melody was there, the dreamy quality that had drawn her to this piece decades ago. As she moved into the second phrase, her right hand suddenly seized up, the tremor intensifying into a brief spasm that caused her fingers to strike wrong keys. Margaret stopped, her hands frozen above the keyboard, and for a moment the old panic tried to rise. But then she remembered where she was, remembered the purpose of this showcase, remembered all the performers who had gone before her, their own struggles visible and accepted. She lowered her hands, took another breath, and started again from the beginning. This time the opening came more smoothly, her hands finding the keys with slightly better accuracy. She made it past the point where she had stopped before, moving into the section that she had practiced most intensively. The notes weren't clean, the tempo wasn't steady, but the melody was recognizable, the emotional content coming through despite the technical limitations. She was playing Claire de Lune not as Debussy had written it or even as the simplified arrangement presented it, but as her hands, her Parkinson's, her particular journey allowed her to interpret it. Midway through the piece, Margaret became aware that she was crying, tears rolling down her cheeks as she played. But her hands kept moving, kept finding notes, kept creating music. The crying wasn't from sadness or frustration. It was from the overwhelming emotion of doing this thing she had feared, of being seen in her vulnerability and not being judged for it, of participating in something beautiful even though she couldn't do it perfectly. The tears didn't interfere with her playing. They were simply there, another truth being acknowledged. The final measures of the piece approached, the melody winding down to its gentle conclusion. Margaret's hands were shaking badly now, fatigue and emotion combining to worsen the tremor, but she pushed through, determined to finish what she had started. The last notes came out quiet and wavering, not at all the delicate whisper the piece called for, but they were there, they were played, they marked the completion of what she had set out to do. She lifted her hands from the keys and sat still for a moment, letting the silence settle, letting herself feel what she had just accomplished. Then the applause began, and it was like that first concert but amplified, the audience rising to their feet, the sound washing over her in waves. But Margaret barely heard it. She was too busy feeling the incredible lightness of having faced her fear and survived it, of having offered her imperfect gift and had it received with grace. Patricia appeared beside her, helping her stand, and Margaret realized her legs were shaking as badly as her hands. But Patricia's arm was steady, and together they walked to the front of the stage. Patricia handed Margaret a microphone, and for a moment Margaret wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with it. Then Patricia nodded encouragingly, and Margaret understood. She was being given the chance to speak, to say something to this audience that had just witnessed her struggle and triumph. Margaret looked out at the standing crowd, at the faces still applauding, and struggled to find words for what she was feeling. Finally, she said simply that 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined doing what she had just done, that Parkinson's had taken so much from her, but that this community had given her something back. She said that every performer here today had demonstrated more courage than most people would show in a lifetime, that they had chosen to be visible in their struggles rather than hiding in shame, and that doing so had created something sacred. Her voice broke on the last words and she couldn't continue, but it was enough. The audience seemed to understand what she was trying to say, and the applause grew even louder. Margaret handed the microphone back to Patricia and made her way off the stage, her vision blurred with tears, her whole body trembling with released tension and overwhelming emotion. Richard met her at the bottom of the stage stairs, pulling her into a tight embrace that she melted into completely. He didn't say anything at first, just held her while she cried against his shoulder, all the fear and anxiety and relief pouring out in great heaving sobs. When she finally pulled back, wiping at her eyes, he told her that what she had just done was the bravest thing he had ever witnessed. And coming from Richard, who never exaggerated or offered empty praise, the words carried enormous weight. The final performer took the stage, a 76-year-old man with advanced Parkinson's who played harmonica. His tremor was severe enough that Margaret wondered how he would manage it, but he had adapted his technique, using the shaking itself as a kind of vibrato, letting his body's involuntary movements become part of the music rather than fighting against them. He played amazing grace, and the sound that came from his trembling hands and lips was unlike any version Margaret had ever heard, raw and wavering, and absolutely beautiful in its humanity. When he finished and the audience gave him the same standing ovation they had given everyone, Patricia returned to the stage for closing remarks. She talked about what they had created together, performers and audience alike, a space where ability was defined not by what someone could do perfectly, but by their willingness to try it all. She thanked the performers for their courage, the audience for their support, and the community for embracing this vision of accessible arts. She announced that based on the success of this first showcase, they would be making it an annual event, and the applause that greeted this news was jubilant. After the formal program ended, the community center became a space of celebration and connection. Performers and audience members mingled, sharing stories and exchanging contact information. Margaret found herself surrounded by people wanting to talk with her, to share how her performance had moved them, to tell her about their own struggles with health conditions or disabilities. A woman about Margaret's age told her that watching her perform had given her the courage to go back to painting, something she had given up after developing rheumatoid arthritis. A young man said his mother had Parkinson's and had retreated from all the activities she loved, and he was going to tell her about this showcase, show her that life with the disease didn't mean giving up everything. Michael pushed through the crowd and threw his arms around Margaret's waist, telling her she was the best piano player in the world. Margaret hugged him back, her heart full, knowing that he didn't mean technically best, that he understood in his 7-year-old wisdom something about courage and effort that transcended skill. Linda stood behind him, tears in her eyes, thanking Margaret for everything, for the lessons, for the example, for showing her son that challenges could be faced rather than fled from. One by one, the other performers sought Margaret out, creating an impromptu gathering of people who had just been through something transformative together. They talked about how terrifying it had been to perform, how liberating it felt to have done it, how the support of the audience had carried them through their hardest moments. James said he had forgotten what it felt like to play music for people rather than just struggling through physical therapy exercises. Sarah said she felt like herself again for the first time since her diagnosis, not despite her MS, but including it as part of who she was now. Melissa, the young woman with anxiety, was glowing with an almost manic energy, talking rapidly about how she couldn't believe she had actually done it, how she had been absolutely certain she would panic and run off stage, how instead she had played through the entire piece and the world hadn't ended. She grabbed Margaret's hand and said that watching Margaret stop and start over had given her permission to struggle, had shown her that freezing or making mistakes didn't mean failure. If she had panicked and stopped, she said, she would have known from Margaret's example that she could start again, and that knowledge had paradoxically made it possible to keep going. The television crew that had been filming the showcase approached Margaret for an interview. The reporter, a young woman with kind eyes, asked thoughtful questions about living with Parkinson's, about what had motivated her to perform despite her condition, about what she hoped people would take away from the showcase. Margaret found herself speaking more eloquently than she expected, the words coming from some deep place of truth that the afternoon had opened up. She talked about how illness and disability so often pushed people to the margins, how the arts could be particularly excluding when they emphasized only technical perfection, how important it was to create spaces where struggling was not just permitted, but honored as part of the creative process. As the afternoon wore on and people began to leave, Margaret felt a profound exhaustion settling into her bones. It wasn't just physical tiredness, though the performance had certainly taken a toll on her body. It was the emotional exhaustion that comes from being completely vulnerable, from using every ounce of courage you possess, from opening yourself to judgment and finding acceptance instead. Richard saw her starting to fade and quietly began saying their goodbyes, steering her gently toward the exit. But before they could leave, Patricia caught up with them, her face flushed with excitement and fatigue. She told Margaret that the showcase had exceeded every hope she had for it, that the response had been overwhelming, that she had already received calls from other community centers asking how to replicate what they had created. She asked Margaret if she would be willing to help develop this into a larger program, perhaps even a regional network of adaptive art showcases. The idea was both exciting and daunting, but Margaret heard herself saying yes, that she would think about it, that she wanted to be part of expanding this vision. On the drive home, Margaret sat in the passenger seat watching the familiar streets pass, feeling like she was seeing her neighborhood with new eyes. Something fundamental had shifted in how she understood herself and her place in the world. For 3 years since her diagnosis, she had been defining herself primarily by what she had lost, the career she couldn't continue, the abilities that had diminished, the future she had imagined that would never arrive. But today had shown her a different way of thinking about it, a way that acknowledged the losses but didn't stop there, that asked instead what might be possible with what remained. Richard pulled into their driveway and turned off the car, but neither of them moved immediately. Margaret reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. She told him she couldn't have done any of this without him, without his steady support and gentle encouragement and absolute faith in her. Richard squeezed back and said that she was the one who had done it, he had just been lucky enough to witness it. They sat there together in the quiet car, hands linked, letting the enormity of the day settle over them. The weeks following the Adaptive Arts Showcase brought changes that Margaret had not anticipated. The local television station aired a feature about the event that was picked up by regional news, and suddenly Margaret's story was reaching far beyond her immediate community. Her phone rang with calls from people she hadn't heard from in years, former students and colleagues wanting to congratulate her or share their own stories of dealing with health challenges. Letters arrived from strangers who had seen the broadcast, people living with Parkinson's or other conditions who felt inspired by what they had witnessed. One letter in particular moved Margaret deeply. It came from a woman in a neighboring state who had been a professional violinist before developing severe arthritis. She had completely stopped playing 2 years ago, unable to bear the gap between what she heard in her mind and what her damaged hands could produce. But watching the showcase coverage, seeing Margaret and the other performers embrace their limitations rather than hide from them, had given her a different perspective. She was picking up her violin again, she wrote, not to reclaim what she had lost but to discover what might still be possible. She thanked Margaret for showing her that participation mattered more than perfection. Margaret read the letter to Richard over breakfast, her voice breaking multiple times, and they sat together in silence afterward, both understanding the weight of what had been created. This was bigger than a single performance or even a single event. This was about changing how people thought about disability and ability, about creating permission for imperfect participation in activities that had traditionally demanded perfection. It was about expanding the definition of who got to be seen and heard and valued in artistic spaces. Patricia called with news that the city council was interested in providing funding for an ongoing adaptive arts program, that they wanted to make the showcase a quarterly event rather than annual, that they were exploring ways to offer adapted arts classes throughout the year. Would Margaret be willing to serve on the planning committee? Would she consider teaching a group piano class specifically for people with conditions affecting their mobility or motor control? The opportunities were coming faster than Margaret could fully process them, but she found herself saying yes, committing to things that both excited and terrified her. Her private teaching also expanded in unexpected ways. Word spread about her adapted approach, and she began receiving inquiries from parents of children with various disabilities who had been told their kids couldn't learn piano in traditional settings. A boy with Down syndrome whose parents had been turned away by 3 other teachers. A girl with juvenile arthritis who wanted to play but needed accommodations. A teenager with ADHD so severe that most teachers refused to work with him. Margaret said yes to all of them, intrigued by the challenge of figuring out how to teach each unique student. She discovered that teaching students with disabilities required even more creativity and flexibility than teaching with her own Parkinson's limitations. Every student needed a different approach, different accommodations, different ways of understanding and processing music. The boy with Down syndrome learned best through repetition and visual cues, so Margaret created color-coded sheets that helped him see patterns in the music. The girl with arthritis needed frequent breaks and couldn't practice for long periods, so Margaret restructured lessons around shorter, more frequent sessions. The teenager with ADHD thrived when lessons incorporated movement and immediate rewards, when the structure was loose enough to accommodate his need to shift focus. These students challenged Margaret to become a better teacher than she had ever been before diagnosis. Without the ability to rely on demonstrations and traditional methods, she had to think deeply about what music education really was, what its essential components were, and what was just convention. She found herself questioning assumptions she had held for decades, discovering that many of the rules she had taught were actually just preferences, that there were multiple valid ways to approach almost everything about music learning. Michael continued to progress beautifully, his natural talent becoming more evident with each lesson. He was now playing pieces with both hands, reading music fluently, beginning to understand basic music theory. But more than his technical progress, Margaret was proud of the way he approached music, with joy and curiosity rather than anxiety about perfection. When he made mistakes, he laughed and tried again. When he struggled with a passage, he experimented with different approaches rather than getting frustrated. He was learning that music was a conversation, not a test, and that mistakes were just part of the dialogue. One afternoon in late May, Margaret was teaching Jasmine when the girl suddenly looked up from the piano and asked if Margaret's hands hurt when she played. The question was direct in the way that children's questions often are, cutting past adult politeness to genuine curiosity. Margaret paused, considering how to answer honestly without burdening a 9-year-old with too much information. She said that sometimes they did hurt, and that they always shook, which made playing harder, but that she played anyway because music was important to her. Jasmine thought about this and then said that she thought Margaret was brave, that her mom had told her about the showcase and about how Margaret played even though it was hard. The conversation stayed with Margaret after Jasmine left. She had never thought of herself as particularly brave, had spent most of her life avoiding risk and discomfort, choosing safety over challenge. But maybe bravery wasn't about the absence of fear or the presence of natural courage. Maybe it was simply about deciding that something mattered enough to try for it despite being afraid, despite knowing you might fail, despite understanding that the outcome might be imperfect or even embarrassing. By that definition, she supposed she was brave now, though it felt less like a choice and more like a necessity, like something she had been drawn into by circumstances and community support. Summer arrived, and with it the student recital Margaret had been planning. She held it in her backyard, a casual afternoon event with folding chairs set up on the lawn and refreshments served on picnic tables. All 6 of her students performed, along with a few former students who had heard about it and asked to participate. The level of performance varied wildly from Michael's increasingly sophisticated playing to the halting but earnest efforts of her newest student, the boy with Down syndrome who beamed with pride as he made it through Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. But what struck Margaret most about the recital was the atmosphere, so different from the formal recitals she had organized in her teaching years before Parkinson's. This felt more like a celebration than an evaluation, families cheering enthusiastically for every performer regardless of skill level, children supporting each other rather than competing. When her student with Down syndrome forgot his place and had to start over, The other students spontaneously began clapping a rhythm for him, just as the audience had done for Margaret at her first community center performance. He picked up the rhythm and finished the piece, and the applause was genuine and joyful. Watching her students support each other, Margaret felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond what she had experienced in her previous decades of teaching. These students were learning more than music. They were learning empathy, resilience, the value of effort over outcome. They were learning that community meant showing up for each other, that struggling was part of growth, that imperfection didn't diminish worth. These lessons would serve them far beyond whatever musical skills they developed. Richard, watching from the back of the small audience, caught Margaret's eye and smiled. Later, after all the families had left and they were cleaning up together, he told her that he was proud of what she had built. Not just the teaching or the showcases, but the whole philosophy behind it. The insistence that everyone deserved access to creative expression regardless of ability. He said she had taken what could have been a tragic loss and transformed it into something that served not just her but her entire community. Margaret leaned against him, tired but content, and said that she couldn't take credit for transformation, that it had happened to her more than she had made it happen. Parkinson's had forced her to let go of old ways of thinking, and the community had caught her when she fell. And together those things had created possibilities she never would have imagined. She had simply tried to stay open to what emerged, to keep saying yes even when yes felt terrifying. As autumn approached, Margaret received an invitation that both surprised and honored her. A statewide conference on accessible arts education wanted her to speak on a panel about adaptive teaching methods. The conference would bring together arts educators, disability advocates, and policymakers to discuss how to make arts education more inclusive. Margaret's work, both as a performer and as a teacher, had apparently caught the attention of people thinking seriously about these issues, and they wanted to hear her perspective. Preparing for the conference forced Margaret to articulate ideas that had been mostly intuitive, to put into words the principles that guided her teaching and her approach to performance. She thought about what had changed for her since diagnosis, about what had helped and what had hindered her adjustment. She realized that the biggest shift had been moving from a deficit model to an adaptation model, from focusing on what she couldn't do anymore to figuring out what she could still do if she approached it differently. The conference itself was overwhelming in the best way. Margaret found herself among people who understood immediately what she was talking about, who were doing similar work in different contexts, who were fighting the same battles against assumptions about who deserved access to arts education. She listened to a blind photographer talk about how she created visual art through sound and touch. She heard a deaf musician explain how he composed music by feeling vibrations. She met a dance teacher who had developed a method for teaching students with various mobility limitations. Each person was expanding the definition of what was possible, refusing to let traditional limitations define what art could be. On the panel, Margaret spoke about her journey from professional teacher to someone who couldn't demonstrate the most basic techniques, about how that loss had forced her to discover new ways of teaching that turned out to be valuable for all kinds of students, not just those with disabilities. She talked about the showcases, about creating spaces where struggle was honored rather than hidden. She emphasized that accessibility wasn't about lowering standards but about expanding them, making room for different kinds of excellence, recognizing that technical perfection was only one measure of artistic value. The response to her presentation was gratifying. During the question period, several educators asked specific questions about her methods, wanting to know how they could adapt their own teaching. An arts administrator asked about the logistics of organizing inclusive performances. A disability advocate thanked her for articulating something they had been trying to express for years. After the panel ended, people surrounded her, wanting to continue the conversation, to exchange contact information, to explore collaboration possibilities. Flying home from the conference, Margaret looked out the airplane window at the landscape far below and thought about how much had changed in 18 months. She had gone from someone who could barely imagine playing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star in public to someone who was speaking at conferences about adaptive arts education. She had gone from teaching no students to teaching 8, each one requiring creativity and flexibility that made her a better educator. She had helped create a showcase that was becoming a model for similar events in other communities. But more than any specific accomplishment, what had changed was how she understood herself. She was no longer primarily a person with Parkinson's disease, defined by her diagnosis and its limitations. She was a teacher, a performer, an advocate, a community member who happened to have Parkinson's. The disease was part of her story but not the whole story, one factor among many that shaped how she moved through the world. It still limited her in real and sometimes painful ways. But it had also opened doors she never would have discovered otherwise, connected her to communities she never would have known, taught her lessons about courage and vulnerability that she desperately needed to learn. The second annual Adaptive Arts Showcase was scheduled for the following spring, and Margaret was already working with Patricia and an expanded planning committee to make it even better than the first. They were reaching out to other art forms beyond music, incorporating visual arts, creative writing, and dance. They were developing workshops and master classes to run alongside the performance, creating opportunities for learning and skill development. They were building something sustainable, something that would continue to grow and serve the community for years to come. Margaret had committed to performing again, though she hadn't yet decided what she would play. Part of her wanted to return to Claire de Lune to show how her interpretation had evolved with another year of living with Parkinson's. Part of her wanted to attempt something new, to keep pushing at the boundaries of what she thought possible. She had time to decide, but she wasn't anxious about it the way she had been before the first showcase. She trusted now that whatever she chose would be enough, that the audience would support her struggle, that the trying mattered more than the result. That the trying mattered more than the result. On a quiet Sunday morning in October, Margaret sat at her